Welcome to The Remedy. I'm Jamal Simmons. January 2020 kicked off with a big wave of foreign policy news. Just a few days after we celebrated the new year, the U.S. authorized airstrikes that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani and sent the world into a whirlwind. Here to discuss the developments since then and what all this means for the elections taking place stateside is Reuben Brigety. He's an ambassador and dean of George Washington Elliott School of International Affairs. Welcome, ambassador, dean, statesman, Reuben Brigety. Thank you for being here on The Remedy.
Pleasure, Jamal.
All right. So let's just start with the big story that is happening in the world right now. I'm sure you've been thinking about this and talking about this. The United States has obviously been in the Middle East now for an entire generation. But what happened in Iran a few weeks ago with the killing of Qasem Soleimani and what the impacts are of that?
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you. And as we sit here today and as more information is coming out from various news sources about what led up to the attack, there's a lot more that we know now than we did on the actual eve of the strike. It would appear that General Soleimani had been within the sights of President Trump and his immediate closest circle of foreign policy advisors for at least the last 7 months. Ever since Iran downed a drone that was flying near in Iranian airspace, depending on who you believe, and that the president at the time declined to kill General Soleimani in retaliation to that drone strike, but said that he might be open to it if Iran had targeted or killed other Americans. And so with the death of an American contractor in northern Iraq in late December as a result of Iranian proxy forces, and then a few days later with the assault on the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, what looked like at the time to be a simply impulsive retaliatory act as a result of the attack on our embassy now appears to be the end of a culminating series of certainly thought processes amongst the president's closest advisors leading to the strike against General Soleimani.
So what seems to be, it's funny to call it clear now because it's murkier. What seems to be coming out in the last few days is the president said this was because of an imminent threat that we were due to face. Right. Since then, the administration has been struggling to define what does imminent mean. And as you just mentioned, there's some reports that they've been thinking about this since at least August of last year. Right. So what does it mean if it's not imminent? Why would they come up with the imminent threat language when they first launched this attack?
Sure. Well, first of all, the White House's messaging on this has been abysmal, precisely because they've been all over the map. The reason to argue that the attack was imminent is that there is a justification under international law for preemptive self-defense in result of or in advance of an imminent attack against your forces, your civilians, and your other personnel. The challenge, of course, is that there is no evidence that there was an imminent attack, and if there was, there's no evidence that the killing of General Soleimani would have stopped such an imminent attack, notwithstanding the president's articulation to the contrary. What looks far more likely is the view of this administration that it has been in essentially if not a cold, then a sort of quiet war with Iran for years now, at least for the last couple of years since the president decided to pull out completely of JCPOA, the so-called sort of Iran agreement, with a series of continuing escalatory provocative actions by the Iranians, such as the downing of that U.S. drone, such as the killing of American contractors, such as the attack on the embassy. And thus, the strike against Soleimani was simply a retaliatory strike in the context of what had already been a series of hostilities between.
So what happens if we find out that it's not imminent and the president just decided to kill a foreign government official?
One could argue if there is not an imminent attack and if there is not open declared hostilities, and if a sovereign state like ours decides to kill an official from another sovereign state, that in and of itself is an act of war or an act of aggression that would be illegal. What I suspect the Trump administration would say is that the Iranians have been at war with us for a while, and this was simply a retaliation against a series of provocations. And depending on how you answer that question, goes a long way in answering whether or not you think the strike was illegal. But there's actually, frankly, another broader piece of this. So regardless of whether or not you think, what you think about the legality of that particular strike, or who you think is the true aggressor in these series of escalations, the more problematic question is, what exactly is our policy towards Iran?
Yeah, let's get at that, because
right?
that's a big question. Our policy towards Iran, we could do this around the world about what exactly is our policy, but what is our policy toward Iran that you see?
It's hard to see. If you think about the withdrawal of the JCPOA by the Trump administration, obviously the strike against General Soleimani, the continuing sort of view that the Israelis and the major Arab states around the Gulf collectively share an interest with the United States that Iran is a major threat, existential threat, and crucially that they cannot be negotiated with it because they cannot be trusted. That leads you to a view where either you have to impose maximum pressure of all instruments of state power until the nature of the Iranian regime fundamentally changes, or you continue somehow along a path of escalation that will lead to inevitably greater hostilities.
Okay, so you've got to be hearing this. I'm hearing it as I talk to people who do foreign affairs, both domestically and around the world, that there are great questions about what the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is up to around the world. We see what's happening with NATO and the President sort of destabilizing it in many ways, being focused on how much money people are paying in or how he's interacting. We're seeing that in Iran. What do you hear from foreign diplomats about the nature of American foreign policy making in this era?
So, foreign policy is not arithmetic. It's not as if, you put in a certain set of inputs and you get a definable certain set of outcomes. And there are always going to be exceptions. Nevertheless, there has to be an overall approach for a variety of reasons, both because we have relationships that depend on some level of predictability, and also because we cannot go alone in the world, precisely because of this interlocking series of relationships. So given that, it's hard to understand what the overall approach of the Trump administration is to the rest of the world, with a couple of very big exceptions. If you accept the president's view that whatever America first means, I think clearly President Trump has a very mercantilistic approach to that, which is why, for example, he continues to foster the nature of the U.S.-Saudi relationship on the basis of how much the Saudis are paying for the U.S. military commitments in the region. The Trump administration is not alone in terms of asking our NATO allies to pay much more in terms of the nature of the alliance, but he is, I think, a bit of an outlier in basing the nature of that alliance much more on the nature of a burden sharing by financial aspects, as opposed to what we have in common as a result of a set of values.
Are NATO allies sure that we would come to their defense if they were attacked?
No.
What does that do to the nature of the very transatlantic alliance that we have?
Sure. Well, what I could say is that notwithstanding official communiques and in recent NATO summits, when I talk to my colleagues that are European diplomats in Brussels at NATO headquarters and others, I think the alliance has never been shakier since its founding than it is right now. I think there is a real debate whether or not the Article 5 commitment of truly one for all, an attack on one is attack on all, is really relevant, and how much that means, particularly in the context of a resurgent Russia, particularly in the context of an American president that seems to be more comfortable in the company of Vladimir Putin than he does to be in the company of virtually any other NATO ally. And this is, I think, one of the great stories of the first part of the 21st century is not only whether that alliance, but what does the nature of that change in alliance structure, change in alliance commitment mean for the restructuring of geopolitics, broadly speaking.
All right, so that's what's happening and how people are interpreting it around the world. What's happening inside the State Department? Your office is across the street, yes. Right from the State Department. You spent a lot of your career working in the U.S. State Department, both yes. Here and abroad. What do you hear from your former and current, perhaps, Foreign Service officers that you know? And you train a lot of people to go to the State Department when they leave the Elliott School.
That's correct. I think it's fair to say that morale of the State Department is an all-time low, and that's not simply a matter of how people feel. It's a question of whether or not they feel that they are valued by the leaders they serve, and whether or not, quite frankly, they're even on the same team. Mm. And I think that if you were a foreign adversary, you could not do more damage to American diplomacy than has been done over the last couple of years by this administration. It feels like you could roll a bowling ball through most of the corridors in the State Department, not hit a thing. There is a real sense of the hollowing out. Now, having said that, America's foreign service and civil servants in the State Department are very, very dedicated. They are going about doing their best to do their jobs all around the world. But when you see the way in which this administration treated Ambassador Yovanovitch from the Ukraine, every other ambassador and every other senior person who's working in an embassy abroad says, my gosh, if they can do that to one of our very best ambassadors, they can do it to anybody.
You mentioned being on the same team, and it just strikes me this week that do we even know who the players are on the sides? The President of the United States came out and said that there were 4 embassies that could be under attack. The Defense Department Secretary said a day or two later that he never saw evidence of 4 embassies being under attack. Right. So, it makes you wonder if the DOD Secretary and the President aren't communicating what's happening in a place where you're 3 levels down at Foggy Bottom.
Exactly right. Well, I think everybody has to bake into the cake now that when President Trump speaks, there is a factor of incredulity. Some might use a more colorful term instead of factoring that in about what he says. And when the president said, I think just yesterday, that he believes that 4 American embassies were potentially under threat, that's an outrageous claim. Not only because it makes all of our personnel who are serving in embassies around the world wonder if it was them, but also, quite frankly, we have a legal requirement. If we have information that we know an American embassy is under attack, we actually have a requirement to provide some level of warning to American citizens in that particular country broadly. And for the President of the United States to make that kind of claim, again, just goes to further undermine not only the credibility of the White House, but also, frankly, undermine the credibility of our diplomats in the field.
So I spent a chunk of my time in life traveling around the world in various capacities, U.S. government, private industry. And one of the things that I took great comfort in was a feeling that as an American, I was pretty much going to be okay. I might get pickpocketed, something may happen to me as a normal bit of crime, but I wasn't particularly worried in some of the major capitals that I was in that something would happen to me. Is that a reasonable assurance for Americans in this era, or have Americans become more targets as they travel abroad?
Well, on the one hand, I would argue that it's never been a reasonable assumption that because you're an American, you're safe around the world. I mean, the world can be a very
I was deluded.
place. You're deluded.
Happy delusion.
Right. On the other hand, I do think that the nature of this Iran strike has absolutely made Americans around the world less safe. And the reason is the Iranians will respond. They will have to respond. And if you take a look historically at when the Iranians have had the most influence over the United States, it is when they've seized American hostages. Either when they've seized hostages out of our embassy in 1979 directly, or when proxies in Hezbollah seized Western hostages in Beirut in the 1980s, which led ultimately to the Iran for hostages scheme. We know that over the last 30 years, the Iranians, General Soleimani was principally behind this, have built up proxy forces, not only in the Middle East, but in lots of other places around the world. And I think that it is absolutely legitimate to worry that the nature of Iranian retaliation will not simply be a more kind of force-on-force against American military targets, potentially against American softer civilian targets elsewhere.
So you traveled around the world a lot in your career. Have you ever felt under any particular threat or found yourself in a situation where you felt like, oh boy,
Absolutely.
Things here are getting pretty dicey?
Yeah, of course I have. I mean, some things I can talk about, some things I can't. And I think that those are, quite frankly, no different than those of any other diplomat or person serving directly to the U.S. government, or quite frankly, as people who are working for NGOs, as I have done elsewhere around the world. Sure.
So tell us a little bit about your career, though. How did you get to this particular place? You've had a long career. You've worked on population studies. You've been in the State Department. Yep. You're a former naval officer. How did you get on a path to international affairs that led you to this position of leadership?
Sure. Well, I'm a native of Jacksonville, Florida, where I was born and raised. It's a big Navy town. I was also a child of the 80s. I was a bit of an odd kid in that, I know you're from Michigan. Like, my heroes growing up were not Isaiah Thomas or Michael Jordan. They were Colin Powell and Brent Scowcroft. I read a lot of Tom Clancy novels as a kid, and really wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and was able to go and and did well at the Naval Academy and got a fellowship to go study in England after graduating. And then after returning back and resuming military training, I decided what I really needed to do was go focus on humanitarian work. So when I left naval service, I went to work for Human Rights Watch in their Arms Division on August 13th, 2001.
Ooh.
September 11th happened less than a month after that, and then I was in Afghanistan, and then a year later in Iraq doing some of the first humanitarian research missions of that war. Then I started teaching university for a while, and then I worked at the Center for American Progress. And then when President Obama was elected, I was asked to come in the State Department and the Refugees Bureau, and then the Africa Bureau, and then ultimately as the U.S. Ambassador to the African Union. And while I was in Addis Ababa at the AU, I was recruited for my current job at GW.
What didn't you know as a kid thinking about this world, this career path that you wish you could go back and tell yourself?
Oh, goodness. Well, what I certainly would tell my students now and tell everybody is the centrality of the importance of understanding foreign languages. I speak a couple reasonably well.
What are your languages?
French and Spanish, and then a bit of Amharic because my wife is Ethiopian, and so I speak some of her native language as well. But I think it's vitally important to be able to understand, because as Nelson Mandela said, when you speak to a man in your language, you speak to his head. When you speak to a man in his language, you speak to his heart. And the ability to understand and operate in a foreign language expands your world and expands your ability to communicate with the rest of it.
Which languages would you recommend somebody pick up if they were just starting out?
Whichever one they're most passionate about.
So you don't look at this and say, oh, the Chinese are ascendant, you should go learn Chinese.
No. And in fact, what I tell my students is, don't go where you think the jobs are, go to where your passion is and the world will come to you. Because passion beats discipline every day of the week. And so if you figure out something that you're so passionate about that it's going to make you want to stay up late at night and go eat ramen noodles for that internship for 6 months in a row, then you will develop a level of expertise that the world will need. Maybe a niche expertise, but you'll be the one that has it. And that's where you should focus your time.
What thing, as you look back in your career, you think about that may have happened that you thought, maybe this isn't the right career path for me? Did you ever have a moment where you thought maybe you should jump and go to Wall Street or do something else completely different with your career than what you were doing?
Well, I am a patriot. I love my country and I love the Navy, but it came to a point relatively early on when I realized that I was not a warrior, and for a variety of ethical reasons felt that I really needed to focus more on humanitarian and human rights things. And so when I separated from naval service, my family said, well, fine, you're free and clear. You should go make a lot of money. And I said, that's not how I'm constituted. It's not what I do. Yeah. I do things to help the broader community, and that's how my career has developed for the last 25 plus years, and I'm grateful for it.
And if you had a young person who came to you today and said they were interested in this career also, in addition to languages, what other piece of advice would you give them?
Well,
I'm sure you have this actually all the time.
I have this question. I have this conversation all the time, and what I tell people is, all the basic stuff: get good grades, do internships, study languages. But what I also tell people is, look to your moral center. Whatever your theory of the universe is, you need to get in touch with it and trust it, because foreign affairs students, by definition, want to engage in the world's toughest challenges. And if you do that, you will find yourself confronted with very hard moral choices. And you need to know what doing the right thing feels like before you get there.
Thanks for watching Hill TV on YouTube. Be sure to click subscribe and hit the bell so you know when we post new videos. And head to thehill.com for all the latest political news.